Hi, this is Cliff Bramble. I am the author of The Business Side of Restaurants, and I am here to talk to you about step number one in the book, and which starts on page 19. And this whole chapter and this whole step is really about contracts. And I like to say the contracts are easy to sign that piece of paper, but you know what? It's really difficult to get out of. So, what we don't think about in the restaurant business, and it goes on about this chapter in this chapter, is it talks about the intellectual data and also the contracts as well. Now, we all know that the contracts that we sign on a day-to-day basis, or at the beginning of opening up a restaurant, you could end up with 15 different contracts. And just off the top of my head, I'm thinking about trash contract, linen contract, a copier contract. There might be a phone contract for a lease if you're doing a lease on phones. There might even be contracts for television or internet. But for the most part, when you're doing these contracts, the most important part is to make sure that these contracts are in somebody else's name, not someone you know, but the corporation name. If you put those contracts in your name and your restaurant fails, guess what's going to happen? They're going to come after you. So what's important is if you can speak with your attorney. I always say speak with the attorney because they're going to tell you the best advice most of the time. But it's important to make sure that you have the contracts down so that way there you can understand them. There's nothing worse than signing a 5-year, 60-month lease on a copier, and that in 3 years that copier is obsolete and you still have to continue to pay. And that's not a fun thing because you want to have the most up to date, or you may say, hey, I'm printing more copies and I want to do color copies and so forth. And when you're doing a contract for a copier, for example, you usually get the copier from one company and then a leasing company purchases that copier, and then you have to pay the leasing company the dollars for so long. So it's always important to know how long. I like to say, hey, try to keep a contract at less than 24 months, and that means scribbling it out. If you have to scribble it out with a little uh, uh, your initials, then so do it. But the nice part is that's what this book really talks about. In here, I also talk about on this same step number, I also talk about trademark search. And the reason why is you don't want to open up a restaurant and all of a sudden you never really searched about your trademark and somebody else has it. So in here, I have a QR code that goes to the trademark office, the United States Patent and Trademark Office. And you know what? It takes 2 minutes. You can search for anybody's name or a name that you want to use and see if it's available in your category. That's something that you have to think about. It's a specific category. So if you have a name that you like and you are a restaurant and then that same name comes up as a shoe manufacturer, you probably can use it because it's not a competing product. So, but that's something that you speak with a trademark attorney about. I also have in here about the lease. The lease is in here. Lease contract, page 22. The information on here, there's a lot of it. There's about 5 or 6 items on here that I say, know what you're going to sign before you sign it. But most importantly, before you go back and forth to your attorney, back and forth, make sure that you get a letter of intent from your landlord that you're looking at. And with that letter of intent, it should be all your intentions of what is going to happen on the lease. During that time between the letter of intent and the finalization of a contract for the lease, you can do some due diligence and find out some additional information as well. So there's a lot of information on here. There's information in here about an operating agreement. Now, if you're not familiar with an operating agreement, if you have partners, you're definitely going to need one. I mean, it's really simple. So on page 23, I do talk about the operating agreement and what you're going to need in that information. And that is something that an attorney is going to have to create for you. And, it could be 20 pages, it could be 15 pages, just depends on what you want in it. And making sure that the attorney helps you out and get that agreement for everybody. I also have information on here on the bank commitment sheet. If you are going to be opening up a restaurant, you're going to need a lot of money. You're going to need money for payroll. You're going to need money for everything. But put it this way, there's only 3 or 4 ways that you have money coming in a restaurant: sales, catering, your bar area, maybe some gift cards. But think about how many expenses go out. And that's what is information in this book as well. You probably have 40 or 50, just off the top of my head, thinking about you have 40 or 50 expenses. Well, if you're supposed to have multiple incomes, you have to figure out in your restaurant how you can continue to gain sales so that way you don't keep on just expensing everything and paying everything down. So the bank commitment sheet is something that you're going to get if you are borrowing money from a bank. The banker is going to send a commitment sheet over to you, and they're going to explain the terms of their lease. Of their loan. So that's something that you have to look at, you have to pay attention to, and more importantly is before you sign, if you have any questions, ask the questions. You have to ask the questions, and don't be afraid of it, because if you don't ask questions, then you might never know the answer. Now, on the other hand, if the investors that you have investors are friends or relatives, some people will just say, "Oh, don't worry about it." You know what? You still have to have something in writing. When there's money involved, get something in writing, and that means that either you maybe they have future equity in the company, or you're going to pay them back. But all that information should be in the operating agreement that I mentioned a minute ago. Now, moving on to page number 26. Page 26 talks about the kitchen designer, and that's all part of the contract as well. Now, the loan commitment sheet that's a contract. So once that contract is signed by the bank, the commitment sheet itself, they will adhere to what they promised you. Now, if it's not signed and nobody has signed it, well, they may not adhere to it. So you have to really make sure that they sign that as well as you. And then when it comes time to use the money, you just use the money as you need it. Now, another one of the contracts has to do with kitchen design. The kitchen design is usually the first, one of the first after the lease contracts that you're going to sign. Because number one, you have to get the lease, then you have to have your architect, general contractor, but more importantly, you have to have your kitchen design as well. So the kitchen designer is going to ask you to sign a contract, and that will be one of the first ones. And you have to make sure that you have all your information ready so you can sign that. Now, on this page 28, I'm looking at the real life story on page 28. For those of you who haven't thumbed through the book yet, just not to ruin the surprise, but there's some fun real life stories that I have in this book that I've put together. And they're real instances that happen throughout the night. When you're running a restaurant, owning a restaurant, co-owning a restaurant, whatever it's going to be, believe me, there's something that happens every single night in a restaurant, whether it has to do with a celebrity walking in, somebody falling down, somebody getting drunk at the bar, somebody throwing up at the bar, somebody getting drunk at the table, or strangers walking in the restaurant, you're not knowing what's going on, or even a tornado. I've been through it. It's never fun, but it's always interesting. And you always think you saw everything in a restaurant until something else happens, and then you realize, holy Moses, it's like a never-ending excitement going on in this place. So this particular story that talks about, it's a real life story. It really happened, and it has to do with an individual past employee who unfortunately was stabbed, not directly, but unfortunately it was, in my opinion, indirectly, simply because somebody had thrown some knives that were in a knife bag at the individual, and the bag slipped. Actually, the knives slipped out of the bag and ended up stabbing the guy over on his right side. So there's a pretty interesting story there. I have quite a few of them in here, and this particular one resulted in something called a sucking wound. And I'm not a doctor. I'm not even an EMT. I mean, I can give the Heimlich, and I can help somebody out from choking. But I will tell you one thing. When I learned what a sucking wound was that day, it was pretty interesting, because not only did we have to call the ambulance, but once you call the police or 911 and you say a stabbing, a a ton of police show up. There was probably 6 or 8 policemen that showed up that day, and 2 people in an ambulance. That's about it. And more importantly, all the police say is, "Where's the guy who stabbed the other guy?" And turn around, put your hands in a cuff, and they take him away. Now, on these last couple of pages that I have in here before step number 2, I have information on a general contractor, and also the operating services. Now, the general contractor, you're going to need to sign a contract with them as well. And that's something that you're going to have to look at pretty closely. You're going to have to pay attention to what you need to do, when you have to pay them, how are they going to get paid, and so forth. And most importantly, any change order information that is in that contract. Because there's some information, or some contractors will charge you 20% for a change order, and there's others that will charge you 10%. You want the guys who are only going to charge you 10%, but that normally, sometimes that doesn't happen. But the general contractor contract, you really need to go through that and make sure that you know what you're getting into. And more importantly is, you need to have the right contractor. You don't want to bring in a residential contractor to build a restaurant. You don't want to bring in a commercial building contractor to build a restaurant. If they have never built a restaurant before, I'll go out on a limb and I would say, listen, go out and find somebody else. You don't want your uncle who builds house part-time. You don't want your friends. You want somebody who knows how to build a restaurant. Professional general contractors. That's my advice on here. So that talks about it on page 30. And then when it comes down to the operating services, I have this in here too. And we touch base on that. The coffee machine may have a contract. The copier may have a contract. The music services may have a contract. For example, years ago, I used a company called Muzak, and they always had a contract. These days, you can use Pandora, and they won't have a contract. You just need to make sure they're paying for your music fees. So most importantly, there's some good information in here about what to do and what to sign and when to sign it, rather than just scribbling your name across, because as soon as you scribble your name across, you are liable for it. So that's what I have up in this step step number 1 of the business side of restaurants. You can go to my website at Hungry Hospitality, or you can buy the book on Amazon. And Amazon has the book as a paperback, and I'm working on a hardcover now. So enjoy the book, and I will see you at the next step.